The year was 1978, and Hollywood was buzzing with excitement about a young actress who everyone said was destined for greatness. At just 24 years old, she had that special something that made casting directors stop and take notice. Her name was becoming whispered in the right circles, and after years of small roles and countless auditions, she had finally landed the part that would change everything. The movie was called Desert Winds, a drama about love and betrayal set in the American Southwest. It wasn't a big-budget blockbuster, but it had heart, and more importantly, it had a script that would showcase her incredible talent. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, taking acting classes, waiting tables to pay rent, and never giving up on her dream, despite her family's concerns about the uncertainty of show business. That October evening started like any other rap party. The cast and crew had gathered at a beautiful mountain resort nestled in the Santa Monica Mountains, about an hour's drive from downtown Los Angeles. The resort was one of those hidden gems that Hollywood folks loved. Rustic wooden cabins scattered among tall pine trees, with a main lodge that had a huge stone fireplace and panoramic views of the valley below. Everyone was in high spirits. After 6 weeks of filming in the desert heat of Arizona, they were finally done. The director was pleased with what they had captured, and there was talk that the film might actually get picked up by one of the major studios for wider distribution. For a young actress who had been struggling for years, this was like winning the lottery. She wore a simple white sundress that night, her long dark hair flowing freely over her shoulders. Friends later remembered how radiant she looked, how her eyes sparkled with excitement as she talked about her future plans. She had just signed with a new agent who promised to get her auditions for bigger roles. There was even talk of a screen test for a major studio picture. The party was everything you'd expect from a 1970s Hollywood gathering. Music played from a portable radio, people danced on the wooden deck outside the lodge, and everyone shared stories about the funny things that had happened during filming. The catering was simple but good: barbecue chicken, corn on the cob, and plenty of cold beer and wine. But beneath all the celebration, there was something troubling that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. It started about a month into filming when she began receiving strange letters at her apartment in West Hollywood. The first one seemed harmless enough, just a fan letter from someone who had seen her in a small television role. But then more letters came, and they became increasingly personal and disturbing. The writer claimed to know her daily routine, describing what she wore to auditions and where she liked to get coffee. The letters talked about how they were meant to be together, and how no one else could understand her like he did. What made it even more unsettling was that the letters were handwritten in beautiful script, almost like poetry, but the content was becoming more obsessive with each one. She had shown the letters to her roommate, who immediately suggested they call the police. But this was 1978, and stalking wasn't taken as seriously as it would be in later decades. The police officer who took the report was polite, but not particularly concerned. "Actresses get fan mail all the time," he had said. "Unless this person actually threatens you or shows up at your home, there's not much we can do." The letters had followed her to the Arizona filming location, which meant whoever was sending them had somehow found out where she was working. The production manager had beefed up security around the set, but it was impossible to monitor every piece of mail that came through the hotel. At the wrap party, she tried to push these worries aside and focus on celebrating with her friends and colleagues. She laughed at the assistant director's impression of the cantankerous old cowboy who had played her character's father. She danced to Dancing Queen by ABBA, which had been playing constantly on set. She even did a little speech thanking everyone for making her feel so welcome during her first major film role. But as the evening wore on, she found herself checking the parking lot repeatedly, scanning the faces of the resort staff, wondering if her mysterious admirer might somehow be watching. Her co-star, a kind older actor who had taken her under his wing during filming, noticed her distraction and asked if everything was okay. She assured him it was just excitement about the future, but he could tell something was bothering her. Around 10:30 that night, she made the decision that would change everything. She had been planning to stay overnight at the resort like most of the cast and crew, but suddenly she felt an overwhelming urge to go home to her own apartment, to the safety and familiarity of her own space. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe It was anxiety about those letters, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to leave. Several people tried to convince her to stay. The mountain roads were winding and could be dangerous at night, especially after a few drinks. But she insisted she was fine to drive, that she had only had one glass of wine hours earlier with dinner. She promised to call when she got home, safely. Her car was a 1977 Mustang convertible, cherry red with a white soft top. Her pride and joy that she had bought used with the money from her first paying acting job. She had parked it under a large oak tree at the edge of the resort's parking area. As she walked toward it in the moonlight, her heels clicking on the gravel, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October mountain air. The drive down the mountain started normally enough. She had her radio playing softly, the windows rolled up because it was getting cold. The road was familiar. She had driven it several times during the weeks of post-production meetings. But about 20 minutes into the drive, somewhere along the most isolated stretch of the winding canyon road, something went terribly wrong. The next morning, a jogger found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's door was open. Her purse was still on the passenger seat with money and credit cards untouched, but she was nowhere to be found. Her car keys were missing, and there were no signs of a struggle. The discovery launched one of the most intensive missing person searches in Los Angeles County history. Within hours, the canyon was filled with police officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers from the film industry. Helicopters circled overhead while search dogs worked the rugged terrain below. But despite all the effort, all the resources, and all the hope, she had simply vanished without a trace. The rising star who had been so full of life and promise, just hours before had disappeared into the California night, leaving behind only questions that would haunt everyone who knew her for decades to come. The morning sun was just breaking over the Santa Monica Mountains when the jogger made the discovery that would launch one of the biggest missing person cases in Hollywood history. He had been running the same canyon route for 3 years, but he had never seen an abandoned car with its door wide open like that. Something about the scene made his stomach turn, and he immediately knew this wasn't just someone who had car trouble. Within minutes of his 911 call, the quiet mountain road was transformed into a scene of organized chaos. Police cars arrived first, their red and blue lights flashing against the morning mist. Then came the detective units, the crime scene photographers, and the search and rescue coordinators. By noon, the canyon was buzzing with more activity than it had seen in decades. Detective Rodriguez was the lead investigator assigned to the case. He was a veteran of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department with 23 years of experience. But something about this case felt different from the start. The abandoned car was too clean, too organized. If someone had been kidnapped, there should have been signs of a struggle. If someone had simply walked away from their life, they wouldn't have left their purse with $200 cash still inside. The first 24 hours were crucial. Every missing person case had that critical window where the chances of finding someone alive were highest. Rodriguez knew the statistics by heart. After 48 hours, the odds dropped dramatically. After a week, they were usually looking for a body, not a survivor. The search effort was unlike anything the mountain community had ever seen. Volunteers poured in from everywhere. Fellow actors from the film industry, hiking clubs, church groups, and just ordinary people who had heard about the case on the news. The missing actress might not have been a household name yet, but her story had captured the public's imagination in a way that surprised everyone. Search teams spread out across the rugged terrain in carefully coordinated grids. The canyon was treacherous with steep drops, dense brush, and hidden ravines that could easily conceal a person. Some areas were so remote that searchers had to rappel down cliff faces just to check for any sign of her. The sound of helicopters became constant, their rotors echoing off the canyon walls as they searched from above. Her roommate became the unofficial spokesperson for the family during those first desperate weeks. She was a struggling actress too, someone who understood the dreams and fears that came with trying to make it in Hollywood. Every morning, she would arrive at the search command post with fresh coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers, and every evening she would give updates to the growing crowd of reporters. The theories started almost immediately. In Hollywood, everyone had an opinion about what had happened, and the speculation grew more elaborate with each passing day. The most obvious theory centered around the mysterious letter writer who had been stalking her for months. Police had collected all the letters from her apartment, and a handwriting expert confirmed they were all from the same person. But tracking down the writer proved nearly impossible. The letters had been mailed from different post offices around Los Angeles, and there were no fingerprints. Some investigators believed she had been kidnapped by her obsessed fan and taken somewhere far from the canyon. They expanded the search to include abandoned buildings, remote cabins, and even old mine shafts throughout Southern California. Tips poured in from across the country. People claimed to have seen her in Las Vegas, San Francisco, even as far away as New York City. Each lead had to be followed up, each sighting investigated, but none of them led anywhere. Then there was the theory that made her family the most upset, the idea that she had staged her own disappearance. This speculation grew louder when investigators discovered she had been having problems with her agent and had recently broken up with a longtime boyfriend. Some tabloid reporters suggested she had gotten overwhelmed by the pressure of her rising career and had chosen to walk away from it. Her younger sister flew in from their hometown in Ohio as soon as she heard the news. She was furious about the suggestion that her sister would voluntarily disappear without telling anyone. "She called me every Sunday for 6 years," she told reporters through tears. "She would never just leave without saying goodbye. She was excited about her future, not running from it." The boyfriend theory gained traction when police learned about their recent breakup. He was a musician who played in clubs around the Sunset Strip, and their relationship had been rocky for months. Friends said they had been arguing about her career taking off while his was going nowhere. But when investigators interviewed him, he had a solid alibi. He had been performing at a club in West Hollywood the night she disappeared, with dozens of witnesses. As weeks turned into months, the search evolved from an emergency rescue operation into a methodical investigation. Professional search teams replaced the volunteers. The helicopters stopped flying daily missions. The command post was moved from the canyon to a small office in the sheriff's station. But her family refused to give up. They hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent who specialized in missing person cases. They offered a reward that grew from $5,000 to $25,000 as their desperation increased. They appeared on every talk show that would have them, hoping someone somewhere had seen something that could provide a clue. The private investigator brought fresh eyes to the case. He was convinced that the key lay in those mysterious letters. He spent months tracking down every lead, following every possible connection. He discovered that the letter writer had detailed knowledge not just of her daily routine, but of the film industry itself. The letters referenced specific Hollywood locations, industry terminology, and even inside jokes that only someone connected to the business would understand. This led to a new theory, that her stalker wasn't some random fan but someone within the industry itself, maybe a rejected actor, a jealous colleague, or even someone from the crew of her current film. The investigation expanded to include everyone who had worked on Desert Winds, as well as people from her previous projects. Psychics began contacting the family, claiming to have visions about what had happened. Most were obvious frauds looking for publicity, but a few seemed genuinely convinced they could help. One claimed she was being held in a basement somewhere in the San Fernando Valley. Another insisted she had been taken to Mexico and was still alive. The family followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. The case began to take on a life of its own in the media. Magazine articles speculated about Hollywood's dark side, about the dangers that young actresses faced in a city built on dreams and broken promises. Her disappearance became a symbol of something larger, the vulnerability of young women trying to make it in an industry that could be both magical and predatory. Local hiking groups began organizing regular searches of the canyon, convinced that she was still somewhere in those rugged hills. Every few months, someone would find a piece of clothing or a personal item that would generate new hope, but none of it turned out to belong to her. 2 years after she disappeared, the case was officially moved to the Cold Case Division. Detective E. Rodriguez had retired, and the new investigators had fresh cases demanding their attention. The family's private investigator had exhausted all his leads. The reward money remained unclaimed and the mystery remained unsolved. But even as the official search wound down, her story lived on. True crime writers began researching her case. Documentary filmmakers interviewed her friends and family. Her disappearance became one of those haunting Hollywood mysteries that people discussed at parties and speculated about in coffee shops. And in the Santa Monica Mountains, hikers would sometimes pause at the spot where her car was found, wondering what had really happened on that October night in 1978. The canyon kept its secrets and the questions remained unanswered, waiting for someone to finally solve the puzzle that had stumped everyone for so long. Life has a strange way of moving forward, even when it feels like time should have stopped completely. For the people who loved the missing actress, the world kept spinning despite the gaping hole her disappearance had left in their lives. Each person found their own way to cope with the uncertainty, the unanswered questions, and the constant hope that maybe, just maybe, today would be the day she would walk through the door. Her younger sister took the disappearance the hardest. They had been incredibly close despite the distance between Ohio and California. Every Sunday for 6 years she had looked forward to those long phone calls where they would share everything: career updates, relationship drama, family gossip, and dreams for the future. Now Sundays felt empty and endless. The sister made a decision that would change the course of her entire life. She quit her job as a high school English teacher and moved to Los Angeles, determined to keep the search alive. She rented a small apartment in West Hollywood, not far from where her sister had lived, and threw herself into learning everything she could about missing person cases and victims' rights. It wasn't easy. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was expensive, and without a steady income, she struggled to make ends meet. She worked part-time jobs, waiting tables, doing clerical work, anything that would give her the flexibility to continue advocating for her sister's case. She attended every meeting of missing person support groups, connected with other families going through similar nightmares, and slowly began to understand that her sister's case wasn't unique. There were hundreds of people who had simply vanished, without a trace in Southern California. Families who had been searching for years, decades even, without answers. Young women who had disappeared from parking lots, hiking trails, shopping centers. The sister realized that the system wasn't designed to handle these cases effectively, especially when the missing person was an adult who had no history of mental illness or suicidal thoughts. She started small, organizing monthly meetings for families of missing persons in Los Angeles County. The first meeting had just 4 people. By the end of the first year, more than 30 families were attending regularly. They shared resources, supported each other through the difficult anniversaries and holidays, and pushed for changes in how law enforcement handled missing person cases. The work gave her purpose, but it also brought constant reminders of her own loss. Every new case that came through their support group, every family that joined their meetings, every success story where someone was found alive, it all made her think about her sister and wonder what had really happened that night in the canyon. Meanwhile, the film Desert Winds was released 2 years after the disappearance. The studio had been unsure what to do with the movie, given the tragic circumstances surrounding its star. But ultimately, they decided to release it as a tribute to her memory. The premiere was an emotional event, with cast and crew members speaking about her talent and dedication. Her co-star, the veteran actor who had tried to convince her to stay at the wrap party that night, never got over the guilt he felt. He had been one of the last people to see her alive, and he replayed their final conversation over and over in his mind. Could he have said something different? Should he have insisted more strongly that she stay at the resort? The what-ifs tormented him for years. He began dedicating every award he received to her memory. When he won an Emmy 3 years later for a television movie, his acceptance speech was entirely about her talent, her kindness, and the tragedy of a life cut short just as it was beginning to bloom. The speech was broadcast to millions of viewers, keeping her story alive in the public consciousness. The director of Desert Winds found himself unable to watch the finished film for almost 5 years. Every scene with her reminded him of her excitement during filming, her professionalism, and her dreams for the future. When he finally did watch it, he was struck by how naturally gifted she had been. Her performance was luminous, full of the promise that everyone had seen in her. The movie industry has a short memory, but her disappearance had touched something deeper. A scholarship was established in her name at the acting school where she had studied. Every year it would help a struggling young actress pursue her dreams just as she had done. The scholarship recipients often felt a special connection to her story, understanding the challenges and vulnerabilities that came with trying to make it in Hollywood. Her roommate, who had become the unofficial family spokesperson during the search, eventually moved back to her hometown in Colorado. The apartment they had shared held too many memories: the morning coffee conversations, the late-night rehearsals of audition monologues, the excited phone calls when one of them booked a role. She kept in touch with the family and continued to answer calls from journalists and investigators, but she needed distance from the daily reminders of her missing friend. The private investigator hired by the family never completely closed the case, even though his official contract had ended. Something about the disappearance bothered him in a way that other cases didn't. He had solved dozens of missing person cases over his career, but this one felt different. The evidence was too clean, too organized. It didn't fit any of the typical patterns he had learned to recognize. He would return to the case periodically, reviewing the files, re-interviewing witnesses, following up on old leads that had gone nowhere. His wife used to joke that he was married to two women, her and the ghost of the missing actress, but she understood his obsession. Some cases just get under your skin and refuse to let go. The canyon where she had disappeared became an unlikely pilgrimage site. Hikers would stop at the spot where her car was found, leaving flowers, notes, and small mementos. Local park rangers got used to finding these tributes and would collect them periodically, storing them in a box at the ranger station. Nobody was quite sure what to do with them, but it felt wrong to throw them away. True crime enthusiasts began organizing annual hikes to the location on the anniversary of her disappearance. They would share theories, discuss the evidence, and speculate about what might have happened. Some of these amateur investigators were surprisingly thorough, combing through old newspaper articles, interviewing people who had been involved in the original search, and even conducting their own searches of the area. The case began appearing in true crime magazines and television shows. Each new article or documentary brought a fresh wave of tips and theories from the public. People claimed to have seen her in grocery stores in distant cities, working as a waitress in small towns or living under assumed names. Every lead had to be investigated, even though most turned out to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. Her parents aged rapidly during those years. The not knowing was harder than grief in some ways. Grief at least had an endpoint. You could mourn, heal, and eventually learn to live with the loss, but the constant uncertainty, the hope that never quite died, the fear of what might have happened, the guilt over not being able to protect their daughter, was a special kind of torture. They established a routine of driving to Los Angeles every few months to meet with investigators, check on new leads, and visit the canyon where she had disappeared. These trips became a ritual of hope and heartbreak. They would always return home emotionally drained but somehow unable to stop making the journey. The mystery took on a life of its own in popular culture. Writers would reference it in novels about Hollywood's dark side. Filmmakers would use it as inspiration for thrillers about missing persons. Musicians would write songs about the beautiful actress who vanished into the California night. Her disappearance became a symbol of all the dreams that Hollywood had swallowed without explanation. The years passed. The active search efforts dwindled, but the case never truly went cold in the hearts of those who had known her. Technology began to advance. DNA testing became more sophisticated, computer databases made it easier to cross-reference cases, and new investigative techniques offered fresh possibilities for solving old mysteries. The sister, now in her 40s, and a respected advocate for missing persons' families, never stopped believing that someday she would get answers. She had learned to live with the uncertainty, but she never learned to accept it. Every few years, she would return to the canyon, walking the trails and wondering if her sister was somewhere out there in those rugged hills, waiting to be found. Little did she know that the answers she had been seeking for over 2 decades were indeed waiting in that very canyon, hidden beneath years of erosion, vegetation, and the patient accumulation of time. The mountains had been keeping their secret, but secrets have a way of eventually revealing themselves when the conditions are just right. The winter of 2000 was one of the wettest on record for Southern California. For 3 straight months, storm after storm pounded the Santa Monica Mountains with a ferocity that longtime residents had never seen before. The rain fell in sheets, turning normally dry creek beds into raging torrents and saturating the hillsides until the earth could hold no more water. By early March, the ground was completely unstable. Geologists had been warning about the possibility of major landslides, but the mountains had been holding their secrets for so long that most people had grown complacent about the risks. The canyon where the young actress had disappeared 22 years earlier was particularly vulnerable, with its steep slopes and loose soil composition. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. The rain had finally stopped the night before, and the sun was just beginning to peek through the lingering clouds when the mountainside simply gave way. The sound was like thunder, but it went on and on, echoing through the canyon as thousands of tons of earth, rocks, and debris came crashing down toward the road below. The landslide was massive, covering nearly a quarter mile of the winding canyon, road with mud and boulders some 20 feet deep. Ancient oak trees that had stood for centuries were uprooted and carried along like twigs. The force was so tremendous that it registered on seismographs as far away as Pasadena. County road crews arrived by mid-morning to assess the damage. The crew chief, a weathered man named Tony who had been working these mountain roads for 15 years, had never seen anything quite like it. The slide had completely changed the landscape, revealing rock faces that had been hidden for decades and creating new ravines where none had existed before. "This is going to take weeks to clear," Tony told his supervisor over the radio. "Maybe months. We're going to need heavy equipment, lots of it." The cleanup operation began the next day. Massive bulldozers and excavators were brought in on flatbed trucks, along with dump trucks to haul away the debris. The work was slow and dangerous, with crews having to constantly watch for additional slides as they carefully removed layer after layer of mud and rock. It was on the 4th day of the operation that everything changed. One of the bulldozer operators, a careful man who had been doing this work for over 20 years, noticed something unusual as he was clearing a particularly stubborn section of debris. There was a glint of metal buried deep in the mud, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. At first he thought it might be part of a guardrail or some other road equipment that had been buried by the slide. But as he carefully scraped away more mud, the shape became clearer. It was curved automotive. His heart started beating faster as he realized what he might be looking at. He immediately shut down his bulldozer and called Tony over. The crew chief took one look at what was emerging from the mud and knew they had stumbled onto something significant. Partially buried under decades of accumulated earth and debris was the unmistakable outline of a car. And not just any car, but what appeared to be a vintage sports car from the late 1970s. Work stopped immediately. Tony called his supervisor, who called the county sheriff's department. Within an hour, the canyon was once again filled with police cars and emergency vehicles, just as it had been 22 years earlier when the young actress had first disappeared. Detective Williams was the senior investigator who responded to the scene. She was too young to have worked the original case, but like every cop in Los Angeles County, she knew the story. The missing actress had become part of local law enforcement folklore, the case that had stumped everyone, the mystery that remained unsolved after all these years. As the excavation continued under careful supervision, more of the vehicle became visible. It was indeed a 1977 Mustang convertible, and the red paint was still visible in places despite being buried for over 2 decades. The car was badly damaged, clearly having rolled down the steep embankment before coming to rest in what had once been a hidden ravine. The most shocking discovery came when they managed to clear enough debris to see inside the vehicle. There, still behind the steering wheel, were human remains. After 22 years of searching, of theories and speculation, of hope and heartbreak, she had been there all along, hidden just a few hundred yards from where her car had originally been found abandoned. The scene was both heartbreaking and surreal. Personal belongings were still scattered throughout the car, A purse, jewelry, even a notebook with pages that had somehow survived the decades underground. It was like stepping back in time to that October night in 1978. Detective Williams immediately recognized the significance of the discovery. This wasn't just any old car accident they had uncovered. This was potentially the solution to one of the county's most famous cold cases. She secured the scene and called for the coroner's office and the crime scene investigation unit. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, reporters were gathering at the canyon entrance, held back by police barriers but trying to get any information they could about what had been found. The story made the evening news that night, though officials were careful not to release too many details until they could confirm the identity of the remains. The actress's sister, now in her 50s and still living in Los Angeles, got the call at her office where she worked as a victims' rights advocate. The detective was gentle but direct. They had found a car and human remains that might be connected to her sister's case. Could she come to the coroner's office to help with identification of personal items? The drive across town felt like the longest journey of her life. For 22 years, she had imagined this moment, the phone call that would finally provide answers. But now that it was actually happening, she felt numb, almost disconnected from reality. Part of her had never really believed this day would come. At the coroner's office, she was shown several personal items that had been recovered from the vehicle. There was no doubt in her mind. The jewelry, the distinctive leather purse with the hand-tooled pattern, the silver bracelet with the small charm in the shape of a comedy mask. These were definitely her sister's belongings. The formal identification would take weeks, using dental records and other forensic methods. But everyone involved already knew what the results would show. After more than 2 decades, the missing actress had finally been found. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had the car ended up so far from where it was originally found? Why had no one spotted it during all those years of searching? The vehicle was located in an area that had been searched multiple times, but it had been completely hidden by natural erosion and vegetation growth. Investigators began to piece together what might have happened that night. The car had apparently gone over the embankment at a point where the guardrail was particularly low, probably during the rainy season when visibility would have been poor. Over the years, the natural processes of erosion had gradually buried the vehicle deeper and deeper, until it was completely hidden from view. Local geologists explained that this area of the canyon was particularly prone to soil movement and debris accumulation. What started as a simple car accident had been gradually concealed by nature itself, creating one of the most elaborate, unintentional hiding places anyone could imagine. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the case. The actress had been missing for 22 years, the subject of countless searches, investigations, and theories. And all that time, she had been resting peacefully in her red Mustang, hidden just a short walk from the spot where her abandoned car had first been discovered. The landslide that revealed her final resting place was the same type of natural disaster that had hidden her in the first place. It was as if the mountain had finally decided to give up its secret, to let her family and friends know what had really happened on that tragic October night so many years ago. For everyone who had spent decades wondering and searching, the discovery brought a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, that they could stop wondering and imagining horrible scenarios. But sadness too, because it confirmed what many had feared all along, that she had died that very night, alone and frightened, just as her career was beginning to take off. The recovery operation would take several more days. But the most important discovery had already been made. The missing actress was coming home at last. The forensic investigation that followed the landslide discovery was unlike anything the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office had handled in years. After 22 years underground, the evidence had been remarkably preserved by the mud and debris that had sealed the car like a time capsule. What they found inside would finally answer the questions that had haunted so many people for more than 2 decades. The most significant discovery came when investigators carefully removed a leather journal from the passenger seat of the Mustang. The journal had been partially protected by being wedged between the seat and the dashboard, and while many pages were damaged, several entries were still readable. The final entry, written in her distinctive handwriting, would change everything everyone thought they knew about that tragic October night. Detective Williams spent hours carefully photographing each page before allowing the forensic document examiners to begin their analysis. The journal entries painted a picture of a young woman who was excited about her future, but also deeply troubled by the threatening letters she had been receiving. The final weeks of entries showed increasing anxiety and fear, but it was the last entry, written on the night of the wrap party, that provided the answers everyone had been seeking. In shaky handwriting, clearly written in distress, she had documented what happened during her final hours. The truth was both simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. According to her own words, she had left the wrap party feeling overwhelmed and anxious about the stalker who had been sending her letters. The threatening messages had escalated in recent weeks, and she had been having trouble sleeping. That night, she had decided to drive home to her own apartment where she felt safer, despite the late hour and the winding mountain roads. About 20 minutes into the drive, she had pulled over at a scenic overlook to collect herself. She was feeling dizzy and disoriented, possibly from the combination of stress, exhaustion, and the single glass of wine she had consumed hours earlier at dinner. In her journal, she wrote about feeling like she was being followed, though she couldn't be sure if it was real or just her imagination playing tricks on her. The entry described how she had gotten out of the car to get some fresh air and clear her head. She had walked to the edge of the overlook to look at the lights of Los Angeles spread out in the valley below. When she returned to her car, she noticed that it seemed to be sitting at an odd angle. In her distressed state, she hadn't properly engaged the parking brake. What happened next was a sequence of events that no one could have predicted. As she opened the driver's door to get back in, the car began to roll backward toward the embankment. In her panic to stop it, she had jumped into the driver's seat and grabbed for the brake pedal, but her foot slipped and hit the accelerator instead. The car had lurched backward over the low guardrail and down the steep embankment, rolling several times before coming to rest in what was then a shallow ravine. The final lines of her journal entry, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as she realized the severity of her situation, described her injuries and her growing realization that she was trapped. The forensic team confirmed that the physical evidence supported her account. The damage to the car was consistent with a backward roll over an embankment. Her injuries, based on the position of her remains, suggested she had survived the initial crash, but had been severely hurt and unable to escape from the vehicle. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was the discovery that she had lived for some time after the accident. The journal contained several additional entries written over what appeared to be days, maybe even weeks, as she waited for rescue that never came. Her handwriting became weaker and more erratic as time passed, but her words revealed a young woman who never lost hope that someone would find her. She wrote about hearing search helicopters overhead and trying to make noise to attract their attention, but the car was too deeply hidden in the ravine to be seen from above. She described rationing the little bit of water she had in a bottle in her purse and eating some crackers she found in the glove compartment. Most heartbreakingly, she wrote letters to her family, expressing her love and apologizing for leaving the party that night. The investigation revealed why the car had never been found during the extensive searches that followed her disappearance. The ravine where it had come to rest was hidden from view by overhanging vegetation and large boulders. Over the years, natural erosion had gradually filled in the ravine with sediment and debris, eventually burying the car completely. The area had actually been searched multiple times during the original investigation, but searchers had walked right over the buried car without knowing it was there. The terrain was so rugged and the vegetation so dense that it would have been nearly impossible to spot the vehicle, even when it wasn't completely underground. Detective Williams briefed the family on the findings in a private meeting at the sheriff's station. The actress's sister listened to the details with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding what had happened to her beloved sister. The truth was devastating, but it was also a relief to finally know. She was so close to the road, the sister said through her tears. All those years she was so close to where we were looking. If only we had known. The sister's decades of advocacy work for missing persons had taught her that closure, even painful closure, was better than endless uncertainty. She had counseled hundreds of families over the years, And now she finally understood what they meant when they said they just wanted to know what happened, even if the news was bad. The formal identification process took several more weeks, but DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. After 22 years, the missing actress was finally coming home. The coroner ruled her death accidental, caused by injuries sustained in the car crash combined with exposure and dehydration. The news of the discovery and the truth about what happened made headlines around the world. The story of the young actress, who had disappeared at the height of her promise, only to be found decades later just yards from where searchers had been looking, captured the public imagination in a way that few stories do. Her co-star from Desert Winds, now in his 70s, and a respected veteran of the industry, gave an emotional interview about the discovery. "All these years I've been carrying this guilt about not stopping her from leaving that night," he said. "Now I know that nothing I could have said would have prevented what happened. It was just a terrible, tragic accident." The film industry held a memorial service at the same mountain resort where the wrap party had been held 22 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended, including cast and crew from Desert Winds, fellow actors who had known her, and fans who had followed her story over the decades. It was both a celebration of her life and a finally proper goodbye. Her sister used the occasion to announce the establishment of a new foundation in her memory, focused on improving search and rescue techniques for missing persons. The foundation would fund new technologies and training programs designed to prevent other families from going through the decades of uncertainty that her family had endured. "She always wanted to make a difference in people's lives," the sister said at the memorial service. "Even in death, she's going to help save other families from the pain we've experienced." The burial took place at a small cemetery in her hometown in Ohio, where she was laid to rest next to her parents, who had both passed away in the years since her disappearance without ever knowing what had happened to their daughter. The headstone, chosen by her sister, simply read her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved daughter and sister, her light shines on." At the crash site in the Santa Monica Mountains, the county installed a small memorial plaque. It doesn't mention the circumstances of her death, but simply honors her memory and acknowledges the tragedy that occurred there. Hikers still stop. They're occasionally leaving flowers and small mementos, but now they know the full story. The case officially closed in late 2000, more than 22 years after it began. For everyone involved, the investigators who had worked on it, the family who had never stopped hoping, the friends who had never forgotten her, it was the end of a very long journey. The mystery that had captivated Hollywood and stumped law enforcement for over 2 decades was finally solved. Not by brilliant detective work or new technology, but by the power of nature itself. A landslide had hidden the truth, and another landslide had revealed it. In the end, the young actress who had dreamed of making it big in Hollywood became famous in a way she never could have imagined. Her story became a reminder of how quickly life can change, how precious time really is, and how important it is to never give up on the people we love, even when all hope seems lost. The mountains had finally given up their secret, and a family's long nightmare was over at last.